Your toddler is experiencing speech delays because they had a mask strapped to their face for 2 years. What a shame. Your business closed down because of lockdown policies? That's too bad. You were fired from your job because you refused to get a vaccine that wasn't even proven to prevent transmission of the disease it was designed to do? Oops. It's time to forgive and forget, according to Brown University professor Emily Oster. On Monday, she published a piece in The Atlantic called "Let's Declare a Pandemic Amnesty." She wrote, "In the face of so much uncertainty, getting something right had a hefty element of luck. And similarly, getting something wrong wasn't a moral failing." Brent, what do you make of this?
I think the big thing to do with this is that we have to make a distinction between the two categories of people. Because, look, Dr. Oster has been one of the most moderate, sane voices leading the charge to get schools reopened, to get children back in the classroom since really the beginning of the pandemic. She's been a very moderate voice in this. However, her piece doesn't really specify who she's talking about. Are we talking about amnesty for parents, friends, family members who may have said something to you that wasn't really backed up by the science in hindsight? Or are we talking about the elites? Are we talking about the media types, the politicians, the people who are responsible for making these decisions? Because I would argue that for the former, it makes a lot of sense, right? I said a lot of things to friends of mine about getting the vaccine that I really kind of wish I hadn't said. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who would think the same. But I think that we have to realize that there's probably a different level of accountability that needs to be had for the people who are really promulgating some of these policies. For example, Randi Weingarten, who actually retweeted this article and said, "I agree completely with what Dr. Oster says." She was collaborating with CDC Director Rochelle Walensky to keep schools closed as recently as summer of 2021. Dr. Fauci, of course, was responsible for promoting the noble lie, so to speak, that we didn't need masks initially because he was really trying to make sure that we weren't depleting the supply for healthcare workers. Comes out later that he just said that to make sure that there wasn't a panic rush on masks. Or are we talking about the media, who is demonizing figures like Ron DeSantis or other red state governors and saying things that were like, "Oh, so-and-so Governor DeSantis wants to kill your grandma." Like, are we talking about providing amnesty for those sorts of myths?
Yeah.
Or are we talking about just the people who were receiving and listening to the news?
Yeah, you're right. Oster is really ambiguous about who is culpable, who's gloating right now, and who shouldn't be. I think it's fair to say she's making a nod at Republicans who have been vindicated on school closures and all those other mitigation measures that turned out to be kind of useless and actually had major collateral damage. But frankly, she's claiming that we didn't know better. We didn't know better in 2020. I mean, did we know better in 2021? I think it's actually that you just weren't listening, because there were studies, there were statistical analysis of a number of these different restrictions, whether it was long-term mask wearing and their efficacy, whether it was the mRNA vaccines and whether they prevented spread or really just minimized severe health complications. There was information about that, but that was suppressed, and it was considered very taboo to challenge the COVID regime's narrative. And as a result, there were kind of two Americas. There was the America that challenged the authority of the CDC, that said, you know, I'm questioning what they're telling us right now, because it doesn't really seem like this cloth piece of fabric is actually stopping this disease from percolating across the country. But then there was another America that really just, I mean, you hear the phrase sheep. They really took these edicts like sheep, and they accepted them. They didn't really question them, and they would shame many other Americans, their neighbors. I used to hear about family members who would, literally families in kind of my neighborhood, who would make sure that house guests were vaccinated before they came over for dinner.
Sure.
I mean, that's like a level of, first of all, talk about like just social upheaval. I mean, I would say that there was so much damage both in the way humans interact.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The like just very bizarre very bizarre social disruption, like suspicion of your neighbors, tattletaling on
Sure.
your neighbors.
Yeah.
Like that's the other legacy of COVID. And so we could have predicted that.
Yeah, well, I think we have to remember, like I continually bring myself back to March 2020. There was a lot of unknowns, right? And so especially in the first months, year, even the first year or so of the pandemic, I think that you can excuse a lot of people acting out of caution, abundance of caution was
or
the phrase.
Fear.
Sure. And I think that's totally normal. When you don't know what's happening, you're going to react in those sorts of ways. You want to protect your family, you want to protect your loved ones, your aging relatives, your immunocompromised kids. You're going to do whatever it takes to protect your family. I understand that. What I don't understand is this idea that the media gets a free pass, right? We got a do-over. And so I think that when Randi Weingarten is out there saying, oh, we should just move on, no, you acted selfishly to protect your teachers' union's interests.
Right.
You acted in a way that deserves scrutiny. And so I think that, look, the idea of amnesty is fine, I think, in general. We're talking about like repairing relationships with friends and neighbors, but it doesn't work for the elites.
Right. And Randi Weingarten, I think, is one of those people one of those elites that above all is guilty and should be given accountability at this point, does not get forgiveness whatsoever, because her actions with the teachers' unions at the national level, coordinating with the government to keep schools closed for longer, hurt the most vulnerable subset of American society, children. And studies showed pretty early on that they weren't really transmitting COVID in schools, number one, and two, they weren't developing severe complications from the disease. It was their elder relatives, and yet they were the ones, the daycare kids in New York City, the last group to have mask restrictions lifted. So, and because of that, toddlers are struggling to speak.
Sure, yeah.
I think I read that either the CDC adjusted its standards for how many words 3-year-olds should be able to speak at this age. I mean, there's literal, quantifiable damage, destruction to learning standards, academic progress. Our kids are behind at least a grade level in math and reading. And we were already not really a braggable, we didn't have much to brag about in terms of public education. And now it's just abysmal.
Sure.
So, there are people that we can blame. And it's kind of sad that, we're trying to forgive and forget, like move on,
And I think one of the bigger things about that is this is all sort of talking about in a past tense situation when, in fact, there are a lot of this hasn't really gone away, right? I mean, Dr. Fauci has still been saying you should try and wear a mask in confined spaces in the last couple of weeks.
Right.
And to be honest, no one's really talking about this, but I would not be shocked at all if blue states like New York and California try to reimpose mask mandates in December or January, because inevitably there'll be more cases. And this happened last fall too, is that everyone thought COVID was gone summer 2021.
Right.
And then we had higher caseloads and everything reverted to about a year ago's policies. So
and it kind of, even though you said like Oster, it's sad that she's being lumped in with the bad guys, because frankly, she doesn't really deserve that. She genuinely was ahead of the curve on predicting a lot of this, catastrophe with kids and masks and all that. But I just think if the shoe were on the other foot, frankly, it's like the losers kind of begging for mercy. Like that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing that with these late night talk show hosts saying, you guys, what happened to the kids during COVID? We really hurt them with our policies. And it's like, we've been saying that for 2 years. And now you're trying to pretend that you weren't on the other side, but you were.
Sure. And even and The Atlantic was publishing pieces last fall, less than a year ago, December 2021. The Atlantic was publishing pieces that said, is it safe to hang out with the unboosted? And that's very recent. Like it's easy to feel like, the pandemic is long past and it's water under the bridge.
Yeah,
it really isn't. It was almost 2 years.
That rhetoric of demonizing the other for a choice that at this point, it seems like it was based in reason. Whether you wanted to get the inoculation or not, it didn't make the biggest of difference in terms of stopping the spread, right?
Sure.
Which was what it was touted to do. That's what it was supposed to do. That's what the elites told us it was supposed to do. And the fact that we treated, half the country like second-class citizens, there are some regrets,
Sure.
but we can't pretend like these elites didn't do it,
Yeah.
because they did.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a time when they couldn't go into the grocery store because of, not because of really refusal to get a vaccine, but you had to wear a mask. Like
Right.
there was requirements in order to access basic goods and services, and that kind of psychological trauma on a population,
Sure.
it was kind of unprecedented, and I don't think a lot of people are ready to let go of that. So
Right.
anyway.
So the bottom line is that there does really need to be some accountability for those who led us astray on COVID policy. But I do sort of like this idea of let's have a reset, let's have some amnesty, let's show some grace to people around us who may have said things or may have acted in certain ways based on these sorts of COVID policies. If you want to hear more about the continuing effects of COVID policy, especially what's happened here in New York, why Lee Zeldin, a Republican who really should have no shot of winning the gubernatorial election in this state, why he might actually beat Governor Kathy Hochul, click right here to see our breakdown from last week about that election.